So we've been going through our series in James called Living Proof and talking about how we can't just ascend to this mental belief of how to live our lives or that Jesus is good, that actually it has to come out. Faith has to come out of us. That it has to be, for it to be real, it has to be able to be seen. That people could look at the things that we do and see our faith in action. So we have to hold both of these things in tandem. And this week, as we delve into James, the second part of James chapter 3, James even goes a little bit beneath the surface to say not only what you do is important, but the reason that you do it and the way that you do it is important. So we're getting just a little bit deeper here. But I want to start out with a story, and I'll just make the caveat that I had a completely different story that had nothing to do with me that I was going to tell. But I felt like the Lord this morning told me to tell a personal story, so I had to check real quick with my son who was sitting beside me to see if it was okay, because it's his story and I don't want to tell his story. He said it was okay. So, whenever Eli went to junior high, this is in 6th grade, this was 3 years ago now, 4, he was bullied for the first 2 years of his time. And whenever he was in 7th grade, it was pretty bad. And so we tried talking to people, but every day he would go to school and people would be mean to him. Now, backstory, Eli trained in Taekwondo for a number of years. And so he wasn't scared. He was just frustrated, and he wanted people to leave him alone. So he would go to school and say, "Mom, I wish that they would just hit me, because then I could, because he could." But they didn't. And so it went on and on and on. It's really hard to see your kid come home day after day and feel like they didn't want to go back to school the next day. It's really hard to drop your kid off at school and send them in knowing what's probably going to happen that day. And so after a while of this, my husband and I, who's not here to defend himself, unfortunately, we said, you know what? If it happens again, you make them know that they don't mess with you. You punch them. Like, you let them know. We're not going to wait for someone. You have to let them know that you're not the one, okay? Now, I come from a little bit of ghetto, so that was like inside of me, came out real easy, okay? So this was after a while, this was our instruction to our kid. You let them know you're not the one, okay? And he was always like, I don't know, I'm not supposed to do that, I don't want to get in trouble. So this was probably about a week of like, no, Eli, let him say something, and then you, and so about a week later, I really felt the conviction of the Lord. I really felt like God was like, is that really how we do things? Is that really how we train up a child in the ways of the Lord? So we had to come back to our son and say, hey, you know how you had some hesitation around clocking someone? The Lord has also convicted us of that. You were right, and you're right. That's not the way we do things. We're going to pray. We're going to come up with other ways to really get around this. And so I say that to say the Lord made me share all of that with you, to say that sometimes the wisdom that we have can be confusing. We can look at things and think, this is the right way to move forward with this. Now, if Eli had gone into junior high and punched someone in the face, they probably would have left him alone, right? However, we are Jesus followers, or we try to be. And so that was not wisdom from God that we were relaying. So I say this to say, sometimes that can be confusing. Sometimes we're not sure even which kind of wisdom that we are operating in. Sometimes things that look like wisdom actually aren't, or some things that don't look like wisdom actually are. And so here James begins to peel back the surface, like I said, to say we have to look at why we do things and how we do things and what is built in the community around us based on how we behave to understand if we're operating in heavenly wisdom or earthly wisdom. And so I'm calling this message Wisdom That Produces a Harvest. Would you pray with me? God, I thank you that you're good and that you speak. Father, I pray that you would open us up to what you have for us this morning, whatever that is. I pray that you would give me your words and that anything that I would bring to say that is of me or not of you would fall to the ground. Move us. Speak to us. Heal us this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. And so we're going to look at James chapter 3, verses 3 through 18. And I hope that what we'll see by the end is that wisdom is evident in what it produces in the community around you. So we're going to turn. If you have a Bible, there are Bibles around. You can grab one. It will be on the screen. We're looking at James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. And it says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." And so James is really highlighting, like I've been saying, sometimes it's hard for us to understand which kind of wisdom we're operating by. And so he talks about earthly wisdom, which in the end he calls demonic, and heavenly wisdom. And we can't always tell which is working. We can see, though, which is working, according to James, by the fruit that it produces. And James says that earthly wisdom produces disorder and evil practice. Verses 15 and 16 say, "Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice." Now, I think sometimes this is clear. If we're operating in earthly wisdom, there are some examples. I came up with some examples to help us see. Sometimes we can know that, right? One of the examples I thought of is triangling. And so if you've been through EF, you know what I mean. Triangling, I see some scrunched noses. Triangling is when somebody does something to me, and instead of moving toward that person and having a conversation, I find someone else to talk to about that person and say, "Can you believe that they did this thing?" We might also call it gossip, right? "Can you believe the way they acted? They're such a, or they're so," and this person is left either trying to take that person's side or agreeing with you, right? And I think if we look at that, at least if we think about someone doing it to us, we can see that that's pretty clearly not heavenly wisdom. Another example that I think sometimes we can see as wisdom, but is not really, is when people who are not married decide they're going to cohabitate. They're going to live together. Now, there's lots of benefits to that, right? Especially in this economy, right? Gas is crazy. Groceries are crazy. And so why would we pay 2 rents? We can just be together and pay 1. And we want to be together all the time anyway. And so there's some benefit to that, but what that really produces is confusion about the relationship, about where it stands, about if you're committed to me, about what's mine and what's yours. And so we can see that in these 2 examples, I'm just using them as examples. There's plenty more. If those didn't apply to you, there are others that do. This produces disorder. So those are kind of clear-cut, right? I think if we asked somebody about that, do you think that's biblical wisdom? I think most people would say no. But there are other things that are a little bit deeper or more hidden. And one of the examples that I thought of that really I see pretty rampant in our society is cutting people off or ghosting people who have made us feel uncomfortable. That's something that I think a lot of people, or in popular society, might be celebrated, right? Cut off toxic people. I'm living my life. I'm not going to press into the people who are not pressing into me. But when you meet people who habitually cut off relationships whenever they get any kind of hard, you find that those people are very paranoid, that they're very stuck on how people are maybe thinking about who they are or how they act. What's true is that most people are just trying to do their life. They're so stuck in trying to figure out life themselves, but they're not really thinking about you. But those people who habitually cut people off and ghost people become so anxious in and of themselves, they create this disorder in themselves. And so I hope what you're seeing is that there's this whole range of earthly wisdom that can be kind of sneaky, that can look good on the surface, but then if you walk it back a little bit and you look at the fruit of what it's producing in the community around you, that it's disorder and evil practice. So this is earthly wisdom that I've been talking about. James also talks about another kind of wisdom, and that is heavenly wisdom. And what he says heavenly wisdom will produce is peace and righteousness instead of disorder and evil practice. Verses 17 and 18 say, "But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." So I think it's important to define what righteousness means, because it's one of those churchy words that we kind of say and no one really knows what it means. We kind of all sort of know. But the definition of righteousness is the character of being morally or ethically right. So what heavenly wisdom produces is the right thing. I think a lot of us go around trying to figure out, what is the right thing for me to do? What is the right next thing for me to do? And that is exactly what heavenly wisdom, at least James says, heavenly wisdom produces. And the way that we do that, he says, is by sowing in peace, which means moving away from these earthly ways of doing things, earthly wisdom, and moving toward heavenly wisdom. Easy, right? This doesn't happen naturally. It takes work. And it's not in our nature, it's not in society to tell us how to navigate these things. As I said, it can be very difficult for us to tell the difference. James sort of makes it sound easy, but it can be very hard for us to tell the difference between, is this earthly wisdom? Is this what the world would tell me to do? Or is this what God is telling me to do? And so James takes it a step further and really spells out the character of heavenly wisdom. He kind of goes beneath the surface. And in a lot of James, he just says, do this, don't do that, right? Do this, don't do that. If you do this, you're bad. If you don't do that, you're good, or whichever. But here, he kind of gives you a little checklist almost that you can test. Okay, if I'm moving into this way of being or in this direction, here is the character of what heavenly wisdom looks like. And he says, first of all, it's pure. It's not mixed or adulterated with any other substance or material. Pure wisdom can be trusted. Now, this is good news because sometimes God asks us to do things that don't feel like they're going to benefit us. But what James is saying is that wisdom from heaven is pure, therefore it can be trusted. So when we are tempted to cut people off or just move ourselves away from people who have hurt us or who are behaving in ways that make us feel uncomfortable, we can trust that the wisdom from heaven is pure and can be trusted. That though that might be difficult to move into a situation or a conversation with someone who has hurt us, we can trust that it's good. living with your significant other. Again, there are lots of benefits to that. And some people might tell you that's a bad idea to pay rent in two places. Why would you do that? But we can trust that even though we're paying more money, this way of being, this heavenly wisdom, can be trusted. One of the examples from my own life that kind of rose to the surface was when God called us to plant this church in Altoona. This was he called us 13 years ago. There were lots of people there were some people who told us that this was not very wise. We had a community of people around us. We had a church that we loved. We had friends that we loved. We had great jobs, a house that we loved. But God was asking us to do something that felt crazy and weird, and to give all that up and to move to a place where we didn't have any of those things. We had family and a call from the Lord. And so there were people who said, why don't you just grow where you're planted? You can do all of that stuff, reaching people for Jesus here, but we knew that God had called us to something different. And so what I'm saying is that wisdom from heaven, even though from the outside it may look questionable or like it's not going to be the best benefit for you, it can be trusted. And as I'm looking at you, people, those of you who've walked with Jesus for a long time probably could name on one or two hands the number of times God has asked you to do something that felt like people are going to think I'm crazy. I'm not sure this is the best idea. But pure wisdom from heaven can be trusted. Again, it can be hard to tell. So we're going to move into the character of what heavenly wisdom looks like. And I'm going to tick these off. There's 6 of them. So I'm going to kind of go through kind of quickly. But the first one is peace-loving. Heavenly wisdom is peace-loving and not divisive. And so when I think about the triangling example that I gave, are we people who separate? Are we people who talk or point our frustrations at a person instead of being peace-loving and being willing to go into that situation and make it right? Are we people who talk about the ways that we've been hurt or wronged instead of moving into peace and choosing peace in those situations? I'm going to tell you a quick story. Of me not being peace-loving, I don't know what it is today. The Lord is doing something to me. I used to be an occupational therapist for a number of years, 18 years I was an occupational therapist. And one of my jobs, I came into this facility, and there was a woman, it was the first week on the job, there was a woman there who, in my first week, she stopped me in the middle of the hall, busy hall, there are patients and nurses, and asked me my name. And when I told her my name, she told me something really embarrassing about someone in my family in the middle of the hall with people listening. That was my first week. That was my introduction to this woman, okay? And so as I stayed at this job and worked with her longer, what I found is that was the way that she did her life, that she kind of operated in that way. I could tell you all the reasons that I think that happens in her formation, but we don't have time for that. So what I did was I moved away from her. Our positions were such that she was someone that I was going to need help from time to time, but I never asked her for help. I would do it myself, or I would find someone else who could help me because I just didn't want to deal with her. She had hurt me, and I didn't think she was a safe person. So I basically cut her off. If she said hi, I would say hi back. That's about it. And so I was having this conversation, I think it was with my husband, about her and something that she did. And I said, she needs Jesus, but I don't know who's going to be able to get in there to talk to her about Jesus. And then I was like, shoot. It's me. And so God really invited me to become a peace-loving person. Now, that's a whole story in itself. We don't have time. We can talk later about that. And so I'm just saying, these things fly under the radar, and they can be hard to recognize. So wisdom from heaven is, first of all, peace-loving. Secondly, it's considerate and not demanding. How often are we, when we're helping someone or doing something for someone or serving, are we thinking about how much it's costing us? I see some knowing smiles. Certain personality types can fall into this. I am a personality type who can fall into this pretty easily, where we overfunction and we do all the things. We see a hole and we fill the hole. We imagine that someone could need help, and so we give the help. But then in the background, when what happens, what we hope happens, is that people are so thankful for our help. When that doesn't happen, we, at least in our minds, maybe not in action, can become pretty demanding about how people should behave now that I've been so helpful. Don't they see all the things that I've done for them, that I do every day? Look at all I've done. And so James says that wisdom from heaven is considerate, thinking of others and not demanding. Thirdly, wisdom from heaven is submissive and not in control. Yeah. Do you always have to be right? Are there people who do their lives who you would say are stupid or act stupidly? Maybe if not that, what happens when you're under a leader who begins to flounder a little bit? Are you someone who supports and helps that leader, or are you someone who takes charge because they're obviously failing and you must do it yourself and overcomes that leader who then becomes in control? Are you someone who needs to feel in control of every single situation that you're in order to feel safe? James says that wisdom from heaven is submissive. The next thing is that heavenly wisdom is full of mercy. And I think when we think of mercy, we might think the opposite is like being mean or being rude. But I think the tricky part of this is that I think we get caught up in being fair. That if you do something or behave a certain way toward me, then I have permission now to behave in that way toward you, because that's only fair, right? It's only fair that I do to you what you've done to me. It's only fair that I behave in the way that you've behaved to me. But James says that heavenly wisdom is full of mercy, not fairness. Mercy calls us to love people because we are loving people, not because people are lovable. Mercy calls us to take the L and love anyway. James says that wisdom from heaven is full of mercy. Nextly, I don't know if that's a word, James says that wisdom from heaven produces good fruit versus shiny fruit. When I think about this, when I think about shiny fruit, I think about being puffed up or fake. There's this phrase in the South that I've never experienced, thankfully, but I've heard about, that when someone in the South meets you and you've done something that they don't like, or maybe they're judging you, they'll say, "Oh, bless your heart." They do not mean, "I hope that the Lord blesses your heart." They mean whatever phrase you choose to insert there that is derogatory. And so when I think about shiny fruit, I think about saying or doing the things that will make us look good without actually worrying about if we are being good. Sometimes being good doesn't necessarily look good. And so here we are again with this confusion about heavenly wisdom and earthly wisdom. But James says that wisdom from heaven produces good fruit. The next thing that James says about heavenly wisdom is that it's impartial and not biased. Now, if you were here 2 weeks ago, I preached a whole sermon about not showing favoritism, so I'm not going to delve into that too much. But the question that I rose, and that I'm going to, how would I say that? Offer to you again, thank you, is where do you gravitate? Toward whom do you gravitate? Is it the people who have status? The people who could help you get ahead? The people who could give you what you're looking for, a title or something? Or is it the people who need someone? Is it the people who are on the outside, who maybe don't have the worldly status that the rest of us might have or want? James says that wisdom from heaven is impartial and not biased. And lastly, James says that the wisdom from heaven is sincere and not deceitful. Do we fudge the truth? And I think the word deceit kind of carries a pretty heavy meaning, but I sort of tend towards James and say we should just call it what it is. It's manipulation. Yeah, that one's a little softer, maybe. I think a lot of us don't intend to deceive people, but all of this sort of flies under the radar, and often we can be manipulative and do things for people for our own benefit, and not as much for theirs or because the Lord asked us to. I'm going to tell you another story. This is the last one. Praise the Lord. I'm sweating up here. So when I was an occupational therapist, I worked in a nursing home for a number of years. I loved it. But what was true is that often in my job, this is a different job, I needed help. And so the only people who were there to help me were the nurses. And so I got in the habit of finding out who my patients were for the day and who the nurses of my patients were for the day. And then I would systematically go around to all the nurses and compliment them. I would find something about them that I liked, and I would tell them how great they were. And the reason I did this is because I'm going to need help later, and I want you to remember that you like me, okay? Now, this is tricky, right? Because compliments are lovely to receive. I was intentional to find something I actually did like. I didn't lie about it. However, I would not have just complimented them because I was a busy person. I did it to be deceiving, to manipulate them into getting what I want. I know. The Lord is dealing with me, has been dealing with me, and especially today. And so I share this to say these things fly under the radar and can be very difficult to pick up, especially in ourselves, because we can justify them, and we do justify them all the time. And so what I hope you're feeling, what I intend for you to feel, and what I think James intends for us to feel in this moment is a little bit of confusion, a little bit of at the end of our rope, a little bit of how in the world can I make sure that I behave in that way all the time, because it does sound very confusing and sneaky. How do we do that? Well, James says that the way to operate in heavenly wisdom with all of those characteristics is to sow in peace. Verse 18 says, "Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." Now, what I hope you're hearing as I say that is growth language. Derek talked, I think last week, about how faith is like sowing a seed. We sow it in, and then it grows up. What I mean to say, and what I think James is saying, is that this is work. That it doesn't happen naturally or automatically. It'd be great if it did, but it doesn't. That it's painful and it takes time. This is why we focus so much on emotional health in this church, because so many of the things that we've learned to do and ways that we've learned to behave make us look nice, make us look good, but there's really something else operating under the surface that is not nice and not good. And we have to get at the root of those things to really become different people, to really become transformed into the image of Jesus. This is a growing work. And we can fool ourselves. In order to operate in heavenly wisdom, It is against our human nature. It's against the flow of society, because society would say, protect yourself. And our own human nature says that. Protect yourself. Get ahead. Look good, but do what you have to do. Make sure you look good, but do whatever you have to do so that you're okay. So here we are with a nature and a society that invites us, actually almost compels us toward earthly wisdom. But James in the Bible asking us to participate or operate with heavenly wisdom. The wisdom that we need is from heaven, and it is pure. If you're feeling like you can't do it, good news, you weren't made to. You cannot make this. You cannot just figure out or do life or have enough experience that you always know what heavenly wisdom looks like. You're not created to make it. We receive it. Heavenly wisdom is from heaven and pure, and we receive it. We cannot make it. And the way that we learn it, the way that we begin to recognize it, is over time with Jesus, spending time with him, reading the Bible and letting it read us, being in community with people who are also trying to follow the actual ways of Jesus, who can point out in us things that are not quite lining up, being with people who we disagree with, who might say something different about how we believe or how we act or how we follow Jesus, coming to worship services where we can worship God and let his presence dig down deep into us. I cannot tell you how many times I have been convicted in worship of sin or of things that I'm doing that are not right, just by being in the presence of God. And so the way that we receive heavenly wisdom is by being in the presence of Jesus. We receive it, we don't make it. And so I want to give you kind of a way to judge, like I'm sort of reflecting, I'm holding up a mirror, right? Let's help us look into our own lives. I told a lot of stories about my life, and you can make judgments about that. That's fine. God loves me still. Look at the people around you. We affect them. What you do matters, and why you do it matters. So if you look at your community, if you look at your family, if you look at the workplace, if you look at your school or the places where you find yourself, do you see peace and righteousness around you? Or do you see disorder and evil practice? Now, that might not be your fault, but we can affect change in those places. I want to offer you a question, and we're just going to sit with it for a second. We're going to sit in a little bit of quiet, and that might be uncomfortable for some people. But I'm going to read through the characteristics of heavenly wisdom, and I want you to think about, you can close your eyes so you're not all staring at me. I want you to think about which one of these are hardest for you to operate in. Where do you see yourself having trouble with this? I'm going to read the heavenly wisdom and then the counterpart, which I believe is earthly wisdom that might operate in a similar vein. Peace-loving versus divisive. Considerate versus demanding. Submissive versus in control. Full of mercy versus fair. Good fruit versus shiny fruit. Impartial versus biased. Sincere versus deceitful. Okay. So when we look at the world around us, if we just take stock of the greater world, even the city, the country, I think we would agree that we need people, we need peacemakers who are ruled by heavenly wisdom. We need people who will move into these spaces with these characteristics, with wisdom from heaven, that can make decisions and do things based on those characteristics, and who can affect change in the community around them such that God gets his way more of the time. We need people who are willing to cooperate with God and do the hard work of sowing in peace. I think that we can be those people. I think that it takes time, that it's growth, but I think just one person can affect change in their family. I've seen it over and over again. Just one person can affect change in their workplace. Just one person can affect change in their school. It's hard, but it can be done. And the beauty is you don't have to do it in your own power. God wants that. You can just move into the spaces where God is already inviting you and work with him in what he's doing. I promise you it's much better to work with him than to work on your own. I've tried both.